The biggest new feature introduced by View 3 is the so-called Composition API. It's 100% optional and it's an alternative to the Options API. Now, the Options API is simply what we used thus far for building View apps and components. When you configure a component like this with a data and a methods option, that's using the Options API. You are passing or you are setting various options in the config object of that View instance, of this View component. This approach is absolutely fine, it's not going anywhere, and you can stick to it. That's really important to me. But we now got an alternative to that. You can replace data, methods, computed, and watch with a different option, with a different approach. And that would be the Composition API. Because you might face two main limitations or issues when building bigger View apps with the Options API. For one, code that belongs together logically might be split up across multiple different options, across data, methods, and computed. I actually got an example here, which is not the example we'll dive in this video. This is taken from my View course, where I completely updated it to View 3. And here I, for example, got a couple of components. And in the user list component here, I have some data where I manage my users, but also a search term entered by the user and a sorting logic chosen by the user. And then I have a computed property for deriving the displayed users based on the sorting logic that was chosen by the user of this app. And I also have a search method, so a method related to searching, a method related to sorting. I got a watcher related to searching, another watcher related to searching. And as you can see, that logic is kind of split up, right? We got search data here in the data option. We got a search method. We got search watchers. And for sorting, we also got an option, a computed property, data. It's all over the place. This is not horrible necessarily, but in bigger applications and bigger components, it may result in a lot of scrolling to update your search logic. If I change something here, let's say the name of the entered search term, I have to change it in a couple of places. And such big components where everything is scattered out could become hard or difficult to manage. In addition, reusing logic across components can also be tricky or cumbersome. Here in this demo app, which you find in my course, I do have the projects list component in addition to the user list, and there I also got search logic. Now, we could share this code, maybe with a mix-in, but with a mix-in we would face new difficulties. For example, it wouldn't be obvious where this logic is coming from. We would have to look into all mix-ins, if we're using multiple mix-ins, to find out which mix-in is holding the search logic. That can also be tricky in bigger applications. So these are not technical problems. These might not even be problems for you which you ever faced, and then of course everything is fine, but this could be problems you face in bigger View apps and bigger View components. And that's why you could move from the Options API to the new Composition API, which merges data, methods, computed into one setup method, which you still add to your component config object, where you then use new features to manage it all and to solve these two problems. So to see this in action, I also prepared a little project for us here. You'll find a link attached to this video in the video description to this entire repository of all the changes, which I also cover in another video. And here in this video, I want to dive into this Composition API folder. Once you navigate it into this folder, run npm install and npm run serve to install all dependencies and bring up the development server. And then you'll see a little application which I prepared, which uses the Options API, which still works with View 3. Here is the app I prepared. I can enter some goals like learn Vue, explore the new View 3 course. But if you enter something like learn React, then this won't show up here because I actually have some logic in there to filter for Angular and React and remove such goals that include these terms. That's the little app we have here. I'm using one component in my app, View file, and that's the course goals component. And there I use two other components, goals list and add goal. I'm managing some data here in course goals. I have a computed property for filtering my goals for Angular and React. And I have methods for adding a goal, to be precise, one method which creates a new goal and adds it to the data property. In add goal, I have some data for the entered text and for the validity of the input. I get the add goal method where I check the validity and possibly set this to true so that this error message is shown. And ultimately, if everything is okay, I emit a custom event with the entered text and reset the entered text thereafter. And the entered text data is bound to this input with vModel, so with two-way binding. In addition, I got a watcher where I watch for invalid input and simply log that to the console. In goals list, I got nothing special. Here I just take a prop and output my list items. Now I'm using the Options API here, and now I want to migrate to the Composition API. And let's maybe start with course goals. As I mentioned, we're going to replace data, computed, and methods with something new. So I'm going to comment it out. And we're going to replace it with the setup method, which you can now add to your component config objects. Setup is automatically called by Vue when it creates this Vue component. It's called around the same time when the created lifecycle hook would normally be executed. Now in here you have to set everything up this component needs. All the data, all the computed properties, all the functions, and all the watchers. Now how do we do that, since we don't have these options anymore? Well, data can be replaced with refs, for example. And you need to import something from Vue for that. So import from Vue. And what we import, between curly braces here, is the ref function. A ref is simply a reactive piece of data, you could say. You create such a reactive piece of data by calling ref in setup. It's basically creating a JavaScript variable, you could say, but one where Vue is aware of any changes made to it, and where Vue then is able to update the template if such a change is detected. A ref can take a default value. So here, since I want to replace goals ultimately, I'll pass in an array. Now we can store this ref, this reactive variable, in a constant or variable, and I'll name it goals. And a constant is enough here because we'll never assign a new value to this. We can change the value stored in the ref, but behind the scenes the ref will create a wrapper object around this array, so we'll only change the wrapped value, not the entire ref object. And with that, we got our reactive variable, which holds this array, which, and that's important, is known by Vue, and where, when we change this array, Vue will be aware of those changes, and if we use this array in the template, it will then know where to update the template. So that's one important step. This is how we can replace our data. There also is another way of replacing data. There also is a reactive function which you could use, but I'll not dive into this here. I cover it in detail in my course if you're interested in that, but refs are what I use most commonly, and you can use them for pretty much everything, so here, that's all we need. Now we need to do one important thing here in setup. We need to let Vue know about the things it should be able to use in the template. Setup needs to return what should be available in the template, and that always is an object where you now map the different things you have in setup, like this goals ref, to identifiers of your choice. Can be the same name, goals, or something totally different, like this. And these keys here can now be used in your template of this component. So for example, now I can use user goals here instead of filtered goals if I wanted to. I don't want to, but we could do this. Now we actually don't need goals like this in the template though, because we just used the computed property in the past. So I'm actually not going to expose it, but we're going to add things to this object soon. Let's maybe continue with this computed property then. How do we create this when using setup and the compositions API? Well, we import another function from Vue, the computed function, which is used to create computed properties. You simply call computed and then pass a function to it. This function has to return a value, the value of your computed property. And here, for example, I can use the same logic I used before for filtering my goals. So goals, filter like this, return that, comment it in. And now Vue will automatically see whichever refs or whichever data you're using in this computed property, and it will then recalculate this computed property whenever one of these reactive values changes. For example, here, whenever goals changes, it will then recalculate the computed property. Now we should store the computed property somewhere, and I will name it filtered goals because that's the name I used before in the options API as well. Now we got the filtered goals, and we do need those in the template. So now I will expose them in this object returned by setup, and I will use filtered goals as a key name and then point at the filtered goals constant, which holds the value which should be exposed. And with that, we're exposing all the data this template needs. It also needs a method though. And how do we replace methods when using the composition API? Well, you simply define a function here in setup. This might look strange at first, but you can absolutely add functions inside of functions. So you can define a function inside of setup. And we're doing nothing else here with this anonymous function, by the way. So we can add a function, name it addGoal, for example. And in this function, do whatever you want to do. Now again, I'll do the same as before. So I'll copy the logic I had in the method before. Add this here. And now with that added here, I just have to adjust one thing. It's no longer this goals, but just goals, because I'm referring just to this goals constant, which is part of setup and therefore available in this nested function as well. This will now change goals, and because goals is a ref, Vue will be aware of that change. Since goals is a ref, it will know that this computed property needs to be recalculated when goals changed, and therefore filtered goals will update whenever goals changed. And filtered goals is exposed to the template. That's why the template will also be updated when our goals change. That's how this will work. Now, in order to be able to use addGoal and reference it from inside our template, as we're doing it here, we also need to expose it to the template though. Because by default, nothing is available in the template. We explicitly have to return what should be available there. So here, I can expose addGoal under an addGoal key. And if I do that, I replaced data, computed, and methods in this component with the composition API equivalents. So if we save this now, I get an error. Must use value to read or write the value wrapped by a ref. This is important, and I'm showing this on purpose, because I mentioned before that ref creates a wrapper object, and this is important to be aware of. When you then work with this ref, you're not working with the value you passed to the ref function, you are working with the ref wrapper object. And you get access to the wrapped value by accessing .value on the ref. And this has to be .value. This gives you access to the wrapped value and allows you to change this value or read from it. So we have to use .value for pushing a new goal and for filtering. Now the other error is saying that text is not defined. And that simply is coming from this line here. Of course, addGoal previously received a text parameter. I should still add this here to this function. But now if we save this and reload, this works. And I can learn Vue, but learning React written like this will not be shown. So this is the composition API in action. And I also want to highlight that in this app here, in this mini app, I'm using the composition API in course goals, but not in addGoal. There I still have the options API and not in goals list. So it's not a thing or it's not a feature you have to use in the entire app. You can migrate individual components to the composition API and mix those components with other components that still use the options API. You can even use the options and the composition API side by side in the same component, though the two sides will not really be able to interact with each other, and typically you will probably migrate an entire component. Now, regarding the not able to interact with each other point, in the setup method, you don't have access to this. You can't read any data you might have in the data option. You can't access anything with this in here. And this, of course, could be a problem if you are in a component that needs some props, because normally your props are available through the this keyword. Now, we don't need props here, but if you would need access to props in setup, the good thing is setup receives a props argument. The first argument you get here is a props object, which holds all the props a component might be getting. This component gets no props, so we don't need it, but if you would need it, this is your friend, because using this is not possible in setup. Now, for all the other edge cases, like how you could use this router and so on, you best visit their official docs, or you dive into other resources like my course, for example, because there I dive way deeper into the composition API, and I also cover how to use the router or Vuex with the composition API. But the core logic hopefully is clear now. We can also practice it again on add goal. Here we also have data methods and now a watcher. We can replace all of that with the setup method. And now in there we got data, 2 pieces of data, and therefore again here I will use refs. I will import ref from view, and then simply create a new ref with an empty string, which is my entered text, and also the invalid input, which holds false initially. And then here we can return entered text, and you can use a JavaScript shorthand here. If the value name and the key name is equal, you can omit the value and the colon, and it's automatically expanded to the longer form behind the scenes. And invalid input is also exposed like this. So now these 2 refs are exposed to the template. In the template we're using them, for example, for two-way binding, but also for VIF. And one important note about refs and the template: in the template you don't need to access .value to read or write. You don't need to do this here, because in the template, view automatically drills into that value property for you. So in your JavaScript code, you need to use .value. In the template, you don't. A very simple rule. So now we got the data. We also need the method, the add goal method. So I'll just copy this here and create it as a function like that. Now here, of course, we don't set this invalid input to false, but invalid input.value. We don't check this entered text, but entered text.value. And we update invalid input.value again. We also set entered text.value to an empty string down there. Now what about emitting? How do we do this if we don't have access to the this keyword? I mentioned that setup receives a props object. It also receives a second parameter, a context object, which holds extra pieces of information or of functionality. And on this context object, you can call emit. However, not with a $sign, but just like this. Context is an object with an emit method, which allows you to emit a custom event. And here, of course, we emit entered text.value as a value. Now I don't need props here, so I'll rename this to an underscore so that we still take this argument, but I signal that I'm not planning on using it. Otherwise, this project setup would complain about an unused argument. But with that, we added this function, and we can also expose that under its name to the template. Now what about the watcher? Here, this watcher. We can also set up watchers with the composition API. You can import watch from view for that, and simply call watch in your setup method. Now watch takes two arguments. The first argument is the dependency of the watcher. The second argument is the function that should be executed when that dependency changed. So here in this case, we have this logic here in the watcher, this if check, where I want to log the invalid input output, like this. And this should be logged whenever invalid input changed. So invalid input is our dependency. Not .value, but just the entire ref. For a watcher, if you provide a ref, view will automatically drill into the value property. And whenever this value changes, this function will now be executed. And here we also get access to the latest value. We also get access to the old value if we wanted it as a second argument. Now we then can run this code and we should print this to the console whenever this changed and is true. And that's it. If we now save that all and reload here and open the console to see our log from the watcher, I can add learn view and this works. But if I click add go like this, I get my error here and this watcher console log every time I press this without a value. And then of course I can also enter a valid value again. So now we migrated this to the composition API as well. Now when it comes to app view and goals list, there's nothing we need to migrate here because we're not using data, methods, computed, or a watcher here. And when it comes to props or components, these options are not touched by the composition API. If you use the composition API instead of the options API, it's really just mainly about data, methods, computed, and watch. Lifecycle hooks are also used a bit differently, but that's also not something I'll dive into here. You can check out the official docs or my course to learn all about that, but with this video, you hopefully got a good introduction to the composition API. And now to circle back to the beginning of the video, that the composition API can help us in bigger projects and bigger components. Here's that example from the beginning again, which you find in my course. There we had projects list and user list. And I mentioned that with the options API, the different kinds of logic were scattered out and reusing logic was difficult or cumbersome. Now I migrated it to the composition API, and now the advantage could be that we now have all the search logic in one place. Actually here in a custom hook, in a custom composition function which I created, which now contains the search data, the search computed property, the search watcher, the search function, and exposes all that to the place where this custom hook, this custom function is used, for example, the user list. And I can simply call my custom function here to get access to all that data and so on, which is managed inside in that function. And I can still expose it in this setup method to the template of this component. And I can use the very same reusable hook or composable custom composition function, whatever you want to call it, in projects list, for example. And that can be the benefit of the composition API. It allows you to write elegant code like this, reuse logic, and have all the logic and all the data that belongs together in one place. It's optional, but in bigger projects, it could be useful.